Good morning, everyone. We welcome you today to our Saturday morning Bible study, and we're so glad you could join us. We are recording today from the North Star, and we have Thomas from New York City with us this morning, which is wonderful, and we welcome you all. And Thomas will begin.
Welcome, everybody. We'll begin with a beautiful poem by Mary Baker. To rise in the morning and drink in the view, the home where I dwell in the vale, the blossoms whose fragrance and charms ever new are scattered o'er hillside and dale. To gaze on the sunbeams enkindling the sky, a loftier life to invite, a light that illumines my spiritual eye and inspires my pen as I write. To form resolutions with strength from on high, such physical laws to obey, as reason with appetite pleasures deny, that health may my efforts repay. To kneel at the altar of mercy and pray that pardon and grace through his Son may comfort my soul all the wearisome day, and cheer me with hope when 'tis done. To daily remember my blessings and charge, and make this my humble request. Increase thou my faith and my vision enlarge, and bless me with Christ's promised rest. To hourly seek for deliverance strong from selfishness, sinfulness, dearth, from vanity, folly, and all that is wrong, with ambition that binds us to earth. To kindly pass over a wound or a foe, and memory but part us a while. To breathe forth a prayer that his love I may know, whose mercies my sorrows beguile. If these resolutions are acted up to, and faith spreads her pinions abroad, 'twill be sweet when I ponder the days may be few that waft me away to my God. So this was written in her girlhood. The title is Resolutions for the Day. It's in the Book of Poems by Mary Baker Eddy, page 32.
Beautiful. She had quite a childhood. She had quite a gift. Imagine writing this in childhood. What can you say except that God was with her? You know, she pointed to the sunbeams to inspire her pen as she wrote, which means she was looking up to the source of all skill and all goodness, and it was plainly evident, quite abundant in her with her poetic skill.
Beautiful. It sounds like she sought the purity that brings her closer to God all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Very beautiful.
That was her one desire.
Yeah.
I have a few little articles that Carrie sent me about Mrs. Eddy and the poem. If I could share with you, they're just beautiful, more biographical. Wow, Thomas can eat his breakfast because he just got off the train. So if I read, you can eat, right?
Right.
Okay. All right. Unless if anyone else would like to say something before I. Okay.
Well, I do.
You do. Okay.
I really like this because she's talking about, doing things daily, church. I mean, she's a little girl, so I'm not sure what she was thinking or what, but it's certainly not like Christian Science at this point, I suppose. But, religion is more than going to church on Sunday, is what I'm thinking. She says here to daily remember my blessings and charge. And so, she's asking for God's blessing every day, turning to God every day. And I thought that was just wonderful.
It's beautiful. Very, very good point. It describes how beautiful her home was.
Yes.
In Bow. All right. To rise in the morning and drink in the view, the home where I dwell in the vale, the blossoms whose fragrance and charms ever new are scattered o'er hillside and dale. This is the beginning of a poem titled Resolutions for the Day that Mary Baker Eddy wrote when she was growing up on a New Hampshire farm. Throughout her life, she loved writing poetry, and she loved flowers too. They feature in a number of her poems as well as in her prose. In her book, Miscellaneous Writings, for instance, Mary describes flowers as smiles of God, and in Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, she calls them hieroglyphs of deity. Sarah Clement, a little girl who attended the experimental kindergarten that Mary taught when she was in her 20s, lived next door to the Baker family in Sanborn, New Hampshire. She often spotted her teacher working in her garden in the evening. Mary was exceedingly fond of flowers, according to Sarah. She recalled that she always wore gloves with the fingertips cut off. Once the flowers had bloomed, Mary would cut, arrange, press, date, and paste some of the beautiful blossoms into an album for remembrance. Some years later, when Mary was living in Lynn, Massachusetts, she grew calla lilies, morning glories, and moonflowers on her balcony. A lady who rented a portion of the house remembered that Mary often pinned flowers, perhaps from her very own garden, to her dresses. Mary was so often seen with flowers, in fact, that she moved to Concord, New Hampshire 2 decades later. After she moved to Concord, New Hampshire 2 decades later, the children in the neighborhood began calling her the Flower Lady. At Pleasant View, her country farmhouse in Concord, New Hampshire, where she lived from 1892 to 1908, flowers abounded in gardens, in pots, and in vases. Nesting birds could be spotted hidden among the vines that climbed the clapboard walls. One of the prettiest features of the property was a beautiful gazebo, or summer house as it was called. In the springtime, it was surrounded by a beautiful bed of pansies, according to Mary's friend Irving Tomlinson. And in the summer, roses clambered up its sides. Mrs. Eddy admired many different flowers. She loved mayflowers and trailing arbutus, scarlet hawthorn, and Japanese quince, and she was particularly fond of morning glories. I love the symbol of the morning glory, she said at one time, with its bright promise of the coming light. But her favorite flower of all was the pink rose, a pink Killarney rose, to be exact. As at Pleasant View, the gardens at 400 Beacon Street were well tended and well loved. It was while living in this home that Mrs. Eddy published a final book, a book of poetry that contained new verses and old. Not only would a poem within its pages have the title Flowers, but the very cover of the book spoke volumes about a symbol dear to her heart. "Oh, you have put pink roses on my poems," she told the publisher with delight when she spotted the design on the front. And then this as well. This article was written in observance of April as National Poetry Month in the United States. Now, who knew? This is National Poetry Month. So we all get out your poetry books, and Mrs. Eddy's particularly. So again, she's this quoting Mrs. Eddy. "Oh, you have put my pink roses on my poems." Mary Baker Eddy's face lit up as William Dana Orcutt, head of the University Press in Cambridge, Massachusetts, placed a slim volume in her hands. Earlier that spring of 1910, the press had been commissioned to create a collection of some of Mrs. Eddy's poems, and recalling her fondness for pink roses, Orcutt asked the artist to incorporate them into the book's design. Bound in white, the cover of the sample volume he brought to show her bore an elegant floral motif stamped in green and pink and gold. Inside, mocked-up pages in a substantial cream stock showed off the attractive typeface, and a layout that would include an illuminated capital letter intertwined with more roses at the beginning of each poem. In addition to her obvious delight with the book's design, Mrs. Eddy displayed another emotion that day which Orcott had never seen in her nearly 2 decades of working together, a hint of shyness. Somehow poems seem more personal than prose, she told him as they discussed publication plans. The original intent had been a 100-copy presentation edition for private distribution, but Mrs. Eddy was being encouraged by her staff to approve another edition for the general public. As a collection of what Adam Dickey would describe in the book's foreword as the spontaneous outpouring of a deeply poetic nature, the volume that Mrs. Eddy held in her hands was personal, as much so as an album of candid snapshots. The poems spanned nearly her whole life, stretching back to girlhood with such early efforts as entitled Autumn, Resolutions for the Day. They touched on moments both public and private, triumphant and tender. Laus Deo was written to mark the laying of the cornerstone of the Mother Church in 1894, for instance, while I'm Sitting Alone, written in the fall of 1866, reveals the depth of loneliness she felt as a young woman, missing her mother, her first husband, and her young son. Some of the poems had been published in newspapers and magazines. Others had appeared in Christian Science periodicals. In the end, Mrs. Eddy gave her consent to publish both editions of the poetry collection. The presentation of poems was printed in September of 1910, while notices in the Christian Science Sentinel and Journal later that fall announced an edition for the general public. Cherishing the hope that the opportunity now presented to secure these rare gems of true inspiration, which tell of God's kingdom ever with those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, its message will be eagerly welcomed. So that, and this was beautiful. It was beautiful. And this was, Thomas's inspiration to do these poems for the Bible study each time. And it's a beautiful history of that. And we have a volume with that, with the roses on it. We also, Nancy Bouchant, one of our members, has a new volume.
Yes, she collected a lot of poems too that are not in.
Yeah.
Not in the book.
Yeah, what is
it's a good
called?
edition.
Yeah, yep. Heartfelt or something it's called, yes.
Yeah.
So thank you, Tom. They're beautiful.
Well, in a way, it is an understated aspect about Mary Baker Eddy. I mean, when I was growing up, there wasn't much emphasis on her poetry. I mean, there were the hymns because we sing them in church, right? But, which are kind of similar to the poems, right? But I think some are poems. But, for her general poetry writing, and it seems odd because the one we read today was written in her girlhood. So this was not something that she wrote later as part of founding Christian Science, right? It's just something she did.
Yeah. Well, I'm very grateful because it's introduced me more to these poems, to talk about them in Bible study. And they're beautiful. That Laus Deo, we had one of the Bible studies, and some other. This is certainly a beautiful one of springtime in April.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it shows that the woman in the apocalypse who brings the science of Christianity to humanity was outstanding in everything she did, and why not? I mean, she was a preeminent poet. She was a preeminent businesswoman, establishing all that she had to establish at a time when women could not own property or have rights. She had to get around all kinds of nonsense to be able to accomplish what was accomplished humanly. It had to be divine. So you're right. Her poetry was just, incredible.
Mm-hmm.
As was everything else in her life.
Yes. Yeah, the hymns bring healing to people, and sing them to children and.
Yeah, and like Gary said, it had to be divine. We've been talking about flowers. Just think about it. Who here can make a flower? No, it can't be done humanly. It's divine. Maybe we can plant the seeds, plant the plants, maybe we can water and fertilize. But who's going to make anything grow or bloom? I hope everybody gets the picture. That is all divine. And imagine Mrs. Eddy loved these flowers, wanted them on her book or whatever. And my take on it is, it's because it points to the one cause of all things, that which is divine. Who wouldn't want anything else?
It's very true.
Yep. Yeah. No, I mean, it just shows she saw God as the source of everything good. Mm-hmm. And that's all she ever wanted in her life, was to be closer to God, to be blessed by God.
That's all she ever wanted.
That's all she ever wanted.
Yeah.
She had no other ambition.
So we can look at flowers, we can see color and beauty, but who's going to take it one step further and see that invisible hand that brought it all out?
They would say at Pleasant View, people would stop just to look at her beautiful gardens, roses, and I think the bulbs too. She had the tulips and daffodils, and she loved them.
And she even had large trees.
Yes.
Moved into her yard, and they were so large that everybody around her expected them to die because, you can't transplant a large tree. But they didn't. They flourished.
Mm-hmm. And there were times when she invited groups to come out to Pleasant View. It happened a few times. And there was one healing that was represented. A woman went there with her child, I believe, and saw all the people and realized there were so many people there, she probably wouldn't have a chance to get close to Mrs. Eddy. So she walked out and just said, "What am I feeling here?" And that it was love. And she saw love in every little thing that was going on around her. And her contemplation of love brought about a healing of a physical problem.
Yeah, the little girl that had a boil. Yeah, she had the beautiful, beautiful testimony. It's in the Keystone book. It's also in our little book on children, the watches. Everyone we've read it a few times at the round table, but it's so beautiful.
She realized her own inadequacy as a mother. So
yes.
It's a true sense of motherhood that she saw expressed in Mrs. Eddy's eyes when she worked with the children.
Yes, yeah, because just that one look healed her child. And she said the world looked entirely different after that. She saw love everywhere. It's quite a beautiful story.
Tomlinson also has it in his book of 12 Years with Mrs. Eddy.
Tomlinson, yes, yeah. Yes, it is. It's in a few biographies. Not to be missed.
So one reason I like the poems, and I'm not saying this is either good or bad or whatever, but there is this thought that, she grew up as a girl. There were times when she struggled looking for healing and things like that, right? And then she started writing in the Christian Science, right? So, maybe her spiritual thought kind of developed over time, so to speak. But see, that's how you would come away with an impression, I think, if you just look to her writing, let's say, Science and Health, the textbook, okay? But when you look at her poems, when they were written her entire life, and you look in there, like some of the ones she wrote, like this one today, like when she was in her girlhood, like, okay, there must be some sort of primitive thought here, right? And then as she got older, her spiritual thinking improved, so to speak, okay? But I don't see this in the poetry. I don't see this, like, progression. It seems like she always had a very good thought from the very beginning.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, she did. She was totally receptive, and God was able to. It's like, Mary, the mother of Jesus. She was totally receptive, and God was able to use her.
Yeah.
And
He healed as a child. She healed when she was a child.
She did.
She did.
That's right.
Yeah.
a lot.
Mm-hmm. And she could talk to the dog mentally and heard the voice of God calling her. And yeah.
But I think what to Tom's point is so true. This is not the developed human mind.
Thank you. Yeah.
It is the relinquishment of the human mind so that the divine can shine through.
Thank you. Well put.
Thank you.
I like the story that her little girl, her daddy would be reading the paper at night, and he'd tell her to be quiet, go to sleep. And she'd say, "But Daddy, or Papa, I'll tell you what you're reading." And she would, I love that little girl.
And she was very young at that time. So much so that long words she stumbled to pronounce, but still she would
tell him what she was reading.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go on to our topic.
Okay.
So our topic today is Take Away the Stone, the raising of Lazarus. So story of Lazarus is in John chapter 11 and John chapter 12. So our first question is, what is Perea? Now this to me is an interesting question. I shouldn't jump in here, but I am. This is not a word we find in the Bible, yet we are almost required to know what this is. So I find that kind of interesting today. What is Perea?
Good question.
Yeah, it is.
Good question.
I found go ahead.
Well, it's just it's referred to a lot in the Bible, just not by that name.
Well, I did find an interesting article, Christianity.com by Joel Ryan, and he describes that he evidently did a lot of research. Perea was an arid region located in the east of the Jordan River, which is now present-day Jordan. Unfortunately, the Bible does not talk about its geography much. A Jewish historian, though, described it as a land of harsh deserts and the occasional spring, I'm quoting, which fed the growth of olive trees, vineyards, and palms throughout the region. The Perea's boundaries, according to this man Josephus, extended from the Jordan River on the west into the desert, into the cities of Gerasa and Philadelphia to the east. Evidently, there was a great gorge of the Yarmuk River on the north, and the Ammon River and the city of Machaerus marked its southern boundaries. That the fortress of Machaerus was where John had been arrested by Herod Antipas, and then they said some references suggest that John the Baptist spent portions of his ministry teaching in this wilderness east of Jordan, attracting crowds from Judea and Jerusalem. And they also think that it's possible this is where Jesus was baptized, on the eastern banks of the river. And it says that, let's see, and it goes on that somewhere between, it talks about the timeline that John the Baptist began his public ministry, baptizing people in the Jordan at a place described in John's Gospel as Bethany beyond the Jordan. And I think that's pretty much what I have on the location. And it was an interesting thing to find.
It is interesting. It makes sense that he would be baptizing on the east side because, in The Chosen, how the disciples did not want to go through Samaria, and all the Jews making the trip to Jerusalem would go well around it. So that must have been where they were going. Be an easy place for them to camp out and wait for him.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't there to this area?
Yes, and in the Journeys of Jesus, it talks about when he went there, he did no more public speaking or teaching in large groups in cities near Jerusalem. But when he came here, it said that the people were all receptive. There was no one was antagonistic towards him, and they wanted to know. It said they all wanted to know. Their honest inquiry was, "What will I do to inherit eternal life?" And he taught them, and it was a beautiful time for him. And then he heard about Lazarus.
Thank you. It's a good source.
Yeah, what I read was that this was an area away from Jerusalem. It was kind of out in the country. There weren't a lot of people there. There were a few because there were some areas that were good for farming and good for olive trees and stuff like that. And it was largely Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a largely Jewish area. So, but it was far enough from Jerusalem that it wasn't full of Pharisees and Sadducees.
Mm-hmm.
So it seemed like it was a relatively safe haven for Jesus. When he needed to get away from, when he needed a little bit of rest and refreshment, he could go there. And like you said, the Jew, it was largely Jewish, so they were receptive to him, and they were not antagonistic to him or his disciples. So it was kind of a good place for him to help a lot of people and not have to battle the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the big organization that was in Jerusalem.
Yeah, what I found interesting was, and I'll probably just speak for myself, but, you tend to think that Jesus' ministry was in Galilee and sometimes Jerusalem. But he was also in Perea, which is a different region from the other two, Galilee and Jerusalem.
Yeah, it was kind of a third, largely, primarily Jewish.
Oh, the other point that I thought was very interesting here, they were not seeking miracles, he talks about. They were just seeking his teaching and giving them the kingdom of heaven. I thought that was very interesting.
That is.
Mm-hmm.
I read in a commentary where he expressed more of his emotional side, which I thought was interesting. He called, for instance, Herod that fox. I guess he could as everyone's been saying, he could kind of let down his hair a little more and speak a little more freely, where he wouldn't have. It's where he said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, yet you were not willing. Who could not miss the intense divine longings for this city at the heart of God's eternal redemptive plan? And just some other times where he spoke more bluntly, I guess, and that was because he was feeling more at home, not all the critical thought on him.
Okay, so question number 2. And now we're digging into Lazarus, okay? What can be learned from some of the reactions of people? And I'll list some down below this question. And how did Jesus respond? So it's interesting that this actually, I got this idea from Melinda on this question. Thank you. But it was interesting, like the variety of people who had reactions to, Lazarus, so that was fascinating. So what can be learned from some of the reactions of people? And how did Jesus respond when it came to raising Lazarus?
Well, then the first one you list here, the disciples told him not to go because it was too close to Jerusalem and the Jews wanted to stone him.
That was Peter and Thomas did that.
Yeah.
Spoke right up.
Yeah.
And his answer?
I must go. Let's go. Wake up.
Yeah, he said the 12 hours, first of 12 hours in the day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in another commentary, he made a list of things, what that perhaps meant. He calls it a very, wise and practical statement. Nothing can shorten our time. There's enough time for everything that needs to be done. We only have that time, so it must not be wasted. Jesus is saying that a man must finish the day's work within the day, for the night comes when the work is ended. There are but 12 hours in the day, and it will be sunset before you dream of it. Get done what God has sent you all here to do. And then if anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble. During these hours, no harm could come to Jesus and the disciples. They had to work before the night of Jesus' passion. And then, I have a fixed time during which to work, appointed me by my Father. During that time, I feel no danger. I walk in his light, even as the traveler in the light of this world walks by day.
Thank you. In other words, God told him to go and he was going to go.
Exactly. Many reasons, but this was the time and he's being sent and he was going to move. No matter what opposition there might come or what danger, this is what God was directing him to do.
And we all know what he did, and it made a huge impression on everybody. So it was obviously an essential part of his mission and his teaching.
I think the hymn is very important. I guess he was waiting, always listening to God and to take a step when God said so. But he didn't go right away, just waited.
That's right. That was, people questioned why he didn't go right away. But yeah, because he listened and did what God did or told him to do. It also said that the Jews believed that the Spirit was around. Did you want to say that?
Yeah, that's right, for 3 days.
Yeah, for 3 days.
So even on day number 4, to prove that life is eternal.
Yes, yeah. They couldn't say, oh, well, the Spirit was around and that's why he could bring him back. He waited deliberately, again, but all through God's direction.
Well, to the second thing that was written here, disciples said, well, Lord, if he sleeps, he does well. So they were kind of happy, right? Because he's not really dead, right? He's okay. He's just sleeping, right? But that sort of speaks to people's understanding right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the waiting till 4 days. Like, let's be very clear about this, right? So.
And he does. He answers them. Lazarus is dead.
Yeah.
Make it clear.
Plainly.
Yeah. We're not.
What appears humanly is that the guy is dead.
Right.
So, and we know that Martha said, Lord, by this time he stinketh. It's just total disbelief.
But Jesus was looking at something other than just a display of matter. A display of matter would say he's dead. And the disciples' reaction were looking for a display of a human body that's just sleeping. But here Jesus is saying, no, in the mental state or in the spirit, he's not active. But I'm going to go wake him up, and then you're going to see the physical evidence of this awakening. Even after the termination of the human law says you only got 3 days in order to do this. He was very clear about the spirit.
Yeah. And I thought you listed Thomas's response here too, which I thought was important, because Thomas said, well, let's go so that we can die also.
I know. Die with our master.
Yeah.
I mean, he was still mesmerized by the experience, of his girlfriend.
No,
that he never
that wasn't
had,
even true.
That he, whatever.
Well, he had a dark thought.
I mean, he terribly dark thought.
Fatalistic.
Yeah. That he hadn't gotten over yet.
Yeah, very pessimistic. I also read too, which I didn't know, that he was called Jesus' twin. Maybe that's what Didymus means. But anyway, he looked a lot like Jesus. So someone said, well, maybe he thought he was going to die instead of Jesus. They couldn't tell who was who. But that's kind of an interesting side.
Well, yeah, he's sometimes referred to as doubting Thomas.
Yes, he is.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
But Mrs. Eddy also says she preferred doubting Thomas to Peter, right?
Yeah. Because there are people that will just accept blindly. She didn't want blind followers.
Yes.
She wanted people to question things and learn and work out their salvation.
Yes. And be honest. He was honest about where he was coming from. He didn't try to please Jesus. He set his mind.
He wanted to understand. Okay.
I was just thinking about this response. Let's go so we can die too. It gives me the picture of an immediate, irrational response. Obviously not even thinking about what he's doing. It just came out of his mouth. And that's the human mind. It reacts emotionally at the moment, and it's irrational. And what we need, of course, is the stability of the mind of Christ. Jesus went through troublous times, but still, inwardly, he was calm, and he had a clear sense of what to do, what to say, and what to do.
Well, and I think this also points to something we all need to be alert to, and that is the devil tries to use discouragement to get us to doing what we need to do. Thomas was obviously being discouraged at this point, and was in effect saying, well, let's give up.
Yeah, like, thanks a lot, Jesus, we're all going to go and die, which was a very negative thing to say, as Bruce was saying, reaction, rather than praying and realizing what was God or what was Jesus actually trying to say and do.
Yeah. It's sort of reminiscent of the Jews saying to Moses, did you bring us out of Egypt to die in the desert?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Lawrence, did you want to say something?
No, just I was laughing at what Jeremy just said. That's exactly it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we know these comments from some of these people were people who were, loved Jesus and very much. And so one of them, Mary, said, if you had been here, Lazarus would not have died. So, I mean, this is not said from a stranger, but someone who was close to Jesus. And kind of remind me a little bit of the Shunammite woman, where she said, did I desire a son of my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me? So here's a woman that was very close to Elisha, and, she thought that he didn't deliver on his promise, right?
Mm-hmm.
But she was very close to him.
Yeah.
I mean, she had a bed in her home just for Elisha, right? So very close relationship there. And not having that trust in.
Yeah, it was interesting because both Martha and Mary said exactly said the same thing. But Mary fell on her feet crying. You certainly see that in The Chosen with this. She was just crying where Martha wasn't. But yeah, well, and they did have that faith, though. They knew if he'd been there, it wouldn't have happened. They had some faith. They just needed to have more faith.
Yeah. Well, and I thought, when Martha confronted him with this point, he answered her, Lazarus will rise again. He was trying to encourage her.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And then she came up with this theological concept theory that, well, everybody arises in the in the last day, whatever that is. In the resurrection, whatever that is. And then Jesus told her, I am the resurrection. And every time Jesus refers to himself as I in the Bible, he doesn't mean the person Jesus, he means the Christ. Mm-hmm. So he's explaining to her that the Christ is the resurrection. This is, he's teaching us something really important. And after Mary said the same thing, Jesus wept. He wept because they weren't getting it. He was teaching them something so profound, and they weren't getting it.
Yeah, it's interesting because the question about how did Jesus respond to all of this, and some of it, he took these times as teaching. Yeah, absolutely. He taught every chance he got. He taught to increase their understanding, and that's why these stories are so significant for us, to stretch our own understanding, to think about it more deeply, not just read it, but what was he teaching? He was teaching a lot, and that was, he always responded with peace and with teaching and calmness and love. But yes, this time he wept.
And then he asked them, okay, where is he?
Yeah, now I'll show you.
Where have they laid him?
Okay, so question number 3, we have actually talked about some interesting observations. So one reason I put in there was, like, why did he wait 4 days? There seemed to be some differences in how Martha was thinking and Mary was thinking, right? But if there's any other interesting observations people would like to make.
Well, just from this book that I was reading, The Journeys of Jesus, it said he groaned also because all of these people, they were a rich family, well known, and all these Pharisees and other people came from Jerusalem to weep, but Jesus knew it was not sincere, and he did not like it, and that's one of the things that upset him. It was not sincere caring for Lazarus, and I thought that was interesting. They just showed a little bit of the chosen, the people who came to help.
Yeah, the professional mourners,
right,
and the flute player or whatever.
Yeah.
And he was not pleased with that. So he didn't say anything to them. He groaned, and then he went on.
Yeah, I read the groaned meant actually anger and indignation.
Yes, yeah, it said that too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Angry at what was going on. All these emotions, all of this that was going on, all these people, the different thoughts, unbelieving, incredible sadness. Plus, it was one of his good friends, and to perform this in front of everyone, a so-called miracle. Florence?
I think he also shows compassion and empathy with Martha and Mary, and then we see here Jesus's own triumph over death. The whole idea of his incredible divine authority over the darkness of death.
Yes.
It also said that because of the raising of Lazarus, many of the common people left the grip of control of the Pharisees and Sadducees to go over to the teachings of Jesus. And the Pharisees and Sadducees did not like it. They didn't like losing the grip of control over these people. And these Pharisees and Sadducees even wanted to kill Lazarus.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And it gives you an idea of the extremity the human mind will go to try to maintain its grip of control. And it's something to be wise about. And I thought it was amazing. Of course, we've known all along the human mind is a murderer. But just think about it. He was a guy who had his life saved. And they wanted to kill him because it didn't reflect favorably on them. Geez, thanks a lot.
Let's talk about malicious animal magnetism.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's see. Could Jesus raise him a second time?
But we see that, don't we, in big organizations that have been taken over by the human mind, even so-called religious organizations. We certainly see it in government organizations. Sometimes people even expect it in government organizations. But we don't so often expect it in so-called religious organizations, but it can be even worse in so-called religious organizations.
And that idea of him weeping, yes, his deep love and compassion, as well as disappointment. A lot of things flooded over him, but it showed there's nothing wrong with weeping when you need to.
Or being angry when the offense is to God.
Yes. In one of these commentaries, there's a list of all the people that have wept. It said Jesus dignified the tears of others in the Bible who wept and all who weep. Abraham wept when he buried Sarah. Jacob wept when he wrestled with the angel. David and Jonathan wept together. Hezekiah wept over his sickness. Josiah wept over the sin of his nation. Jeremiah was the weeping prophet. Oh, what were you going to say, Jeremy?
Oh, just one thing I was thinking about when he was groaning was just how he had to have just so much trust in God that even though it did not look like it, what he was doing would have a lasting effect. Even though the people he'd been teaching for almost 3 years didn't seem to understand any of it. So it's amazing the resoluteness he had in that.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that Jesus apparently often had to remind his disciples that it wasn't him personally doing any of this stuff. that it was God working through him. He had to remind them of that often, because they were seeing a human personality doing stuff that they didn't think was possible to do.
Okay, so I'll just mention that one of the attachments for the lesson Bible study today is listing out people who were raised from the dead in the Bible. So we can see, just make the observation that there are stories of people being raised from the dead in the Old Testament. There are stories of Jesus raising people from the dead. There are stories of people being raised from the dead after Jesus had ascended, by Peter and Paul. So Lazarus was not, unique, like the only case. So what can we learn from this about, the question here is, how did Jesus raise Lazarus? So how did he do that, right? Now, I did put another attachment there that hopefully is helpful for people, but I copied off some articles that are on the Plainfield website that relate to this topic. But if you found something else, that would be great. But how did Jesus do this?
Well, it's in the lesson this week. He was able to raise Lazarus because he knew he never died. I think that's the fundamental point. He knew there was no death, and he knew it.
Yeah.
The life that is the big L life, God, it's undying. Never dies. So,
now, as a consequence,
yes.
Lazarus heard Jesus, just as God heard Jesus, and there was total communication there, and he rose.
Yeah. Jesus didn't personally raise Lazarus. God did. Mm-hmm. And Jesus brought with him the knowledge of everlasting life so clearly, so without any doubt. And he lived it so fully himself that everlasting life couldn't help but be manifest where he was. And God used that. He was a pure transparency for God. He was God's, beloved son. And he knew it. But he also knew the truth about Lazarus and everybody else too.
Yeah, Jesus restored Lazarus by the understanding that Lazarus had never died, not by an admission that his body had died and then lived again. Had Jesus believed that Lazarus had lived or died in his body, the Master would have stood on the same plane of belief as those who buried the body, and he would not have resuscitated it.
And Mary, remember it happened in our church several times?
I do.
And so the same thing was going on. God was awakening the patient.
Yes.
And I remember I was laying unconscious, and I could hear Mrs. Evans talking to me. And I woke up years ago and went about my life. So I just fainted of sorts. So these things are currently still happening.
And they should, and they will.
Yeah.
Whenever a pure, transparent thought enters the room, because God is there.
you're pulling them back from the belief that they want to pass on, or there's some mesmerism over them, and you're pulling them back from that. And if they're willing, they will come back. And it's natural more than miraculous.
Mm-hmm.
And Mrs. Eddy, on several occasions, she brought Calvin Fry back for that reason.
And others.
And she said that, when Asa Eddy passed on, her husband, and her students in the home hadn't told her in time, and she said, they were working on the wrong thing. They were working on whatever was heart or something like that. But she said it was that Era was trying to take her help from her, and that's how she brought Calvin Fry back, because she knew that it was Era trying to take her help from her. And she insisted, "You're not going. You're coming back. You're not going."
Mm-hmm.
And then when asked where he was when he seemed to have passed on.
Oh, I love that part. He said he was in the
kitchen getting a piece of pie.
That reminds me, I didn't know that about Asa Eddy.
Mm-hmm.
They were praying for him, and they wouldn't tell Mary Baker Eddy.
Yeah.
So this is just like Carol Norton. We're not going to disturb Mary Baker Eddy.
Yeah. I didn't know that story.
And he was a great thinker.
He was a great thinker, and he went much too soon.
Yeah.
And had just married, right? He just gotten married to another worker. And what was the story you were telling us about Mrs. Eddy and David Keaston?
Yes. Thank God for David Keaston, who got this story, because back in 1910, there was a time when there was 3 people with Mrs. Eddy, and 2 of them went down with the furnace repair person to take a look at the person, and Adelaide Still stayed with her. And then Mrs. Eddy passed on. But some days later, Adelaide Still was there, and she saw Mary Baker Eddy pass through the room as a young lady. So she obviously had continued to live, but she came to show, and Adelaide Still was the one who saw it. Well, she told the directors, and the directors told her to keep her mouth shut. Don't relate this story. Well, she did tell her sister, and her sister was conducting, in years later, tours of Chestnut Hill. David Keaston goes to Chestnut Hill to have a tour. And Adelaide Still's sister told David Keaston this story. And then it is related in his book. But were it not for that event, we would not know about it. Because literally no one else knew it.
And David Keaston was attacked for writing that book and putting that in. He said he wrote, it was just hearsay and things like that. He put the book down. The organization.
Yeah, that's right. And I will say the things that are in David Keaston's book have been researched and proven to have been so.
Yes, he wrote back. They sent some letter, and he wrote back a scathing letter. Good for him, saying how he'd researched everything. He was quite sure of it all.
And if they could prove that any of it was wrong, he would
take it out.
And they never did. They couldn't disprove anything.
But he also said the organization is not the only source for this information.
Thank you.
There are other reputable sources of information, and you don't have exclusive control over all the sources.
Thank
you, organization.
Thank you. Yes.
So, a little different topic, but one of the thoughts that I really like, Martha Wilcox wrote this. So this is in the attachment that's included in today's Bible study. And she wrote, every disease is a symptom of death. Therefore, disease overcome is a reduction of the belief of death.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So, in some sense, the healing work that we do every day, whatever it is, right, is all part of the process of denying death
Mm-hmm.
and birth too, right?
yes.
Yeah.
And affirming the eternity of life with God.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think there's one more thing that needs to be said about this, and it's in the golden text, do the commandments, and then you have the right to the tree of life. There's a reason why we're alive. And it's not just so that we can keep breathing and then the part can keep pumping blood through the system. We have a purpose for living. And so, if we obey God, we have it exhibited in a good life. So,
And longevity
Yeah.
to stay here and do what needed to be done.
yeah, I've often felt that's the secret of life. Be useful to God.
Exactly. That's so true. Ask yourself, are you? It's very important. If you don't have a purpose to live, again, when someone goes on, Mrs. Evans would say, no one ever goes on unless they consent to it. And if you don't have a real purpose to be here, or you've let your life just spin out of control in some way, it's easy just to give up or let go. But when you've got a reason to get up in the morning, I mean a good reason, not just to make money but a good, pure,
Play with your toys.
Precisely, then you're going to get up and do it, and for as long as God wants you to do.
Happily.
Happily.
Joyous.
Yes, and in good health. And we're not on the road to death. We're on the unending road.
Eternal life.
Eternal life. Mary Baker Eddy. Yes, a paraphrase, but which has no sense of death.
Sounds like a grand journey.
A grand journey it is.
Yeah. Someplace I'd like to go.
We own it.
We don't have to go anywhere to be there.
No, we don't have to travel. We don't go anywhere. We're just there if you want to be.
Well, this has been good. Anybody have anything else they want to add?
Could I just, one of my favorite parts is, come forth, Lazarus. And I just wanted to say that. There's an article on our website called Come Forth by Kate Buck, and I think you quoted from her. She said exactly the same thing. But then she says that we all must come forth to know the truth.
Thank you. Yep, can't hide in the shadows.
Well, and the topic, take away the stone, I thought it was very significant.
Thank you.
We need to take away the adamant of error. Take away the stone heart.
Mm-hmm.
Take away.
Let it go.
Exactly, the blockage of mortal belief.
And that's exactly what Jesus was doing when he said, come forth. He was removing that stone, the adamant of error. And in doing that, he raised Lazarus.
With the universal solvent of love.
Yeah.
Yes, universal solvent of love. He overcame it all. And he knew his next challenge was...
Yeah, he had an even bigger challenge ahead.
Yep. That was the next thing that happened, right? The crucifixion and resurrection.
Yes.
So that was wonderful. Thank you, Thomas and everyone.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.